Good morning, students. I call this video for the first week, Introduction to Immigrants. Why? Because this week we are primarily focusing on a spectrum of stories. We are focusing on stories from 3 different sources, 2 required sources, and 1 optional source. So the required sources are The God Who Sees by Karen Gonzalez, and I want you to read the whole text, and then Welcoming the Stranger, and I want you to read chapters 1 and 2 of Welcoming the Stranger. There's also an optional video produced by the Evangelical Immigration Table called The Stranger. That video contains the case for comprehensive immigration reform from an evangelical perspective. That's not why I'm offering it to you as an option. You're welcome to look at that if you like, but I'm really offering it to you because it has some very compelling, powerful stories of immigrants encountering a broken immigration system. I think they're well worth watching to get a better sense of who immigrants are. So why is that such an important place to start? Well, remember what we're studying in this course is, on the one hand, the phenomena of migration, and on the other hand, the response of the church. At the core of the phenomena of immigration are the people called migrants. Now, those are not the only people in the story of immigration. The sending country and the receiving country, and all of the people contained in both those countries, are also important players in the story of immigration. But the bottom line is that you won't understand the phenomena of immigration without understanding something about the people who are called migrants. And this is particularly important for us as Christians. Matthew chapter 12, verses 9 through 13, is one of the multiple stories of Jesus' healing on the Sabbath. And the point that Jesus makes in all of those stories is that even though the law is important, in this case the Sabbath law, I mean, remember the Sabbath is one of the 10 commandments, it's important. Even though the law is important, there are many instances in which the importance of the law pales in comparison to the primary importance of the life and well-being of every human being, as someone for whom Jesus died. Now, of course, that refers to both the migrants themselves, the members of the sending country, and the members of the receiving country. All of their lives and well-being are equally important. But again, we will not understand what it means to say that the lives and well-being of migrants are important unless we understand more about migrants. So that's what we're focusing on this week. And of course, I talked a little bit in the last video about your assignment for this week, that after reading The God Who Sees, which is a personal story of the migration experience of Karen Gonzalez's family, and an understanding of that story in the light of biblical texts and stories, right? Your assignment is to write your own migration or immigration story, the story of your family. And of course, for some of us, that is forced migration. And for others of us, it's hard to get that information, right? It happened too long ago. But do your best. I appreciate creativity. I understand that sometimes it's needed, right? Some of our stories are much more accessible and obvious than others. But to tell that story in the context of the biblical narrative. So that you're all going to do. Welcoming the Stranger gives some very specific stories which broaden the story that you're reading in The God Who Sees. And of course, the Stranger gives stories of the conflict between immigrant stories and the immigration system. So we're starting with stories, and we have theological reasons for starting with stories. Now, I want to say a little bit about the information that you will receive in Welcoming the Stranger, in the reading from Welcoming the Stranger this week. And I need to start by saying that I assign more academic and less academic books in this course. All the books that I assign are solid. The information in them is fundamentally accurate. It's not always unbiased. Everyone has a bias. Can't escape it, but it's relatively unbiased. It's solid information. But the non-academic books, and I would put this in the category of the non-academic books, are written not to the academic community, but to the church. And I think that in itself is very important for many of you who are serving churches and who will be serving churches. The question is not only what is the information, but how do you communicate it effectively in a church context? And so when I assign you a less academic book, I want you to notice not just what it says, but how it says it. I want you to ask yourself, does Welcoming the Stranger communicate well to an evangelical church community? How would it read in my community, for example? So it's a meta message. I'm interested in the content, and also I'm interested in you observing the process. So Welcoming the Stranger doesn't just talk about the stories, the reading that you're doing this week, doesn't just cover the stories of individual migrants. It also looks at some of the commonalities between who migrants are and who migrants are not, some of the myths that many people carry about migrants. So I just want to articulate the framework that Welcoming the Stranger is giving you with respect to that slightly bigger picture. Those of us who work in the arena of migration often talk about the drivers of migration as falling into three primary categories: blood, sweat, and tears. Those are also the categories that in many countries define who the country allows in. So those can work also as a set of requirements as well as a driver for coming. So what do we mean by blood, sweat, and tears? Blood is blood relationship. So a relationship if you're immigrating to the U.S., and Welcoming the Stranger is a U.S.-centric book. Some of the books that we're reading are U.S.-centric, but we will try as much as possible to include how migration functions in the rest of the world as well. So I'm sorry, most of the books that we have are written with a U.S. focus, but I'll try to show the application, the larger application. So blood means that you have a relationship, a kinship relationship, to somebody who has a right to be in the country. So in the U.S., that would be a family member of you, a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident. The sweat category refers, in the U.S. context, to a sponsored employee of a U.S. citizen, but it essentially refers to people coming for work. The third category, tears, refers to a group of people that are commonly called refugees unless they apply for refugee status at the border of the country that they're trying to immigrate to, and then they're often referred to as asylum seekers. And these are people who are fleeing violent persecution in their country of origin as a result of a particular characteristic, such as race, religion, or political opinion. So that gives you a broader picture of who migrants are, and as you read the individual stories, you can see how these stories relate to these categories. And of course, they're not simply separated, right? They interact, and you'll see that in these categories. Then Welcoming the Stranger also talks about the common myths about migrants, talks about who migrants are not. And there are three common myths that Welcoming the Stranger refers to. I do want to name that they are common not only in the United States, but in many countries in the world. We're doing some work in Latin America, and these myths about migrants are common in Latin America as well. So the first myth is that migrants are a drain on resources. And of course, some migrants are, right? When I say that these are myths, It doesn't mean that there are no migrants that fit into these categories. It just means that the vast majority of migrants don't fit into these categories, and migrants as an aggregate don't fit in these categories. But many people think of migrants in these categories. I hope that makes sense. So, drain on resources. Are migrants a drain on resources? And welcoming the stranger responds to that in the U.S. context, but I think it's applicable. Are migrants primarily criminals? And are migrants terrorists? And of course, in the U.S. context, that usually is referred to as Muslim terrorists. So I hope that this gives you a beginning framework that you can use this week as you delve into the stories, as you allow the stories to speak to you, as we allow the stories to be a foundation for the work that we will do together the rest of this quarter.